Is a board seat right for you with the board readiness expert, Dr. Donna Hamlin. Today, I'm so pleased to be joined by Dr. Donna Hamlin. She's a corporate executive with 30 years of corporate governance and strategy consulting experience. She oversees BoardWise's global programs, including its centers and their services. These include board evaluations, professional certification and training, its global registry of qualified directors, board Bona Fide, registered, its strategic partnership programs, and its BoardWise Center. She's certified for governance by the National Association of Corporate Directors in the U.S. and in global governance by Harvard University. Prior to her role at BoardWise, she founded Hamlin Harkins, Ltd., where she developed a successful track record in strategy change management and human performance management, serving clients from Fortune 500 global enterprises to startup companies in more than 30 countries. She holds Ph.D. and MS degrees from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a BA degree from Siena College, and has studied at the University of London. She's a published author and writes management articles in the area of strategy, brand value management, change and human performance management, and she holds various board directorships. Donna, I am so incredibly excited to have you here today. I have loved meeting you in person on many occasions, and this subject could not be more relevant to the topics of today's climate, especially here in California. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over the presentation to you. Give me just one moment, and you should be all set, so welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. That introduction sounds like my mother wrote it. Okay. This is a perfect time for women to be looking at the opportunities for a career path that may include serving on a board. And I'd like to spend the time today walking you through a little bit about what to expect. If you're just kicking the tires for the first time, what things to prepare. Feel free to chip in with any questions that you've got that Erin will manage, and we'll see if we can't answer things in real time as we go. Everybody looks at this from a different perspective. It may be that you're interested in your professional growth. It may be that you're looking to support yourself by getting an actual board seat, or just trying to understand how the governance works relative to whatever you're doing in your own positions. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about what you need to know about board service in today's environment, and a little bit about the governance landscape, not only in the U.S., but around the globe. And then what things can you do if you want to become a great board director? To start, though, let's ask some questions just to see how board savvy we are. And you can type in what answers you're going to guess as we go through. And the first question is, what developed countries don't always require boards at all? Okay, no one's guessing here, so I guess I'll just tell you. If you go to Denmark, there's no need necessarily, it's not obligatory that you have a board. They have a management group that they use, but you can, of course, have a board, and 90% of the companies choose a board for reasons that we'll talk about. What country requires board evaluations to be done by an independent third party with no conflict of interest? The UK. It requires by law that every 3 years you have to have an independent third party. The Netherlands are also pushing for that legislation. It is not required in the U.S., and for the most part, companies heretofore have just done their own board evaluations, except that we're noticing in this most recent year and a half or so, more companies are asking us for that sort of help. So the progress of what's going on in Europe is pushing us forward. When is a director free of his or her responsibilities to a company? Never while it's on your watch. Even if you retire or you resign, anything that you've done or were affiliated with while you were on the board, you are still responsible for. So you can't just up and quit when the board is doing something wrong. You're still accountable. What's the most recent country to impose a quota for board diversity? I know everybody wants to say California, it's the US, but it's not really the whole country, it's just California. Saudi Arabia, interestingly enough, they just recently passed that it should be one woman. And somebody in the news announced that, oh, they finally earned their keep. Imagine that. What two countries have the lowest gender diversity record on public boards? South Korea, that's one, and Japan. They have the lowest record for diversity. Can you identify any countries that have hard law diversity rules? That means laws that have sanctions, there's teeth in it. Mostly coming out of Europe. You'll see India, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, France, and Norway, which started everything. We have a long way to go in terms of getting our records right, but those are the leaders in that. How many countries have the lowest bar for standards when you're trying to get listed on the exchange? Germany's the easiest one. So if you have a company and you want to go public, the fastest way to do it is to go to Germany and get listed on their exchange. They watched what was happening when China was interested in coming into exchanges, and they entered ours on the NASDAQ. And what happened was that they were coming in without the benefit of the knowledge of the requirements, and so there was a lot of to do about getting them off the boards because they weren't complying. And the number of them was so high that Germany looked and said, well, we can do that, but we'll fix it. So they went and emptied a lot of shells, cleaned them up, and then made them available for $25,000. So a number of companies slid onto their exchange. Now, that means that they got high volume, more than double what most of the other exchanges have, which is fine, except that they've got to manage those, and many of those slid in for the same reasons without benefit of knowledge. So I suspect there's going to be a lot of compliance issues coming with that. Which countries are pushing for requirements that board directors have permanent education credits? That's not true in the United States. Here, it's considered a good thing to get continuing education, but it's not required. In Europe, the EU is pushing for what they do call permanent education, not just occasional, but every year, 40 hours of updates and training, which is important because the laws, the regulations, the rules are changing rapidly. In what country do the boards have the duty and responsibility to hire not only the CEO, but all of the reports of the CEO? This is extraordinary. The state-owned enterprises in China. Imagine if you're the CEO of a company and you're interested in hiring someone. It has to be approved by the board if it's in China for the SASAC operations. That's a little trickier to do if you would like to manage and you're overridden or overjudged by virtue of what the board may have to say. In what country is it both mandatory to do annual board evaluations and then present the findings to the shareholders at the annual meeting? The only country so far that's doing that is Vietnam. They are being much more transparent about findings. Here, because we're so afraid of activist shareholders and things that may constrain activities, most board evaluations are protected under the general counsel's confidentiality rules, and then they're protected from access to other people. What Vietnam is doing is saying, no, we want to make it understood to all shareholders, and their rights and entitlements are secured that way. Does anybody know the term overboarding? It used to be, there was a day when people would decide that they wanted to get on boards, and they would get on 9, 10 boards and make that their second career. That has been second guessed now, and the rule of thumb now is not to be on more than 3 boards max, but the exchanges are auditing now to look at the directors on boards to make sure that they aren't overextended, because if you're on 9, you're not doing a good job for any one of them. And in history, what's the first example of boards as we know them today? For this, we have to go back in time to look at the early history of our philosophy, not only on the rights of people who are going to be ruled, but also by the Catholic Church, because when the Nicene Creed and all of the activities for the Catholics were being developed, they set up the first form of what we'd call governance, in as much as the Pope was appointed, but they had a council around the Pope. So the Pope really didn't have full power. The Pope was a voice for the council of the alleged wise. It then evolved that the German mercantile system picked up the same concept, because they were trying to raise funds enough to have the ships to be able to do the distribution of goods. And many of the investors were in remote places, and they wanted to create a system where their voices could be heard in terms of the use of the proceeds. Those are very early lock-in mechanisms for what we call governance today. And that's important to understand, because when I first started doing this, I wondered, why do we even have boards at all? They're all around the globe. And if I were creating a business, why would I trouble myself to create a board? And why has it become such a popular notion? It's not the only model that exists. You certainly look at law firms or accounting firms where there are partners. And they have no board. They just put all the partners together, and they rule or judge or decide together without a board. There are sun kings, there are oligarchs, there are all kinds of other alternatives to boards. However, the board-centered model is the most potent that is evaluated today, because there's an assumption about the balance of power. There are shareholders, there's directors, there's executives, there's a whole supply chain of people and their employees all involved in a system. And the belief under here is that if you have that many people with different, possibly different interests, that there needs to be a way of check and balance against those interests, so that we make decisions that are prudent in the best order of everybody, not any one particular slant. So the belief around the governing body is that groups make better decisions than an individual, and that there isn't a right, if there's a shareholder, to be represented and have a voice. And there's an assumption that with central management, it's a practical way to handle people that are distributed, remote, far away, and that it gives us a way to monitor the performance of what we're investing in or trying to accomplish. A lot of people ask about the size of boards. Typically, it can go anywhere from 5 to 25, and more often than not, shareholders are electing them. The duty here is to make sure that the corporations are creating not just success in the moment, but long-term. And there's a lot of movement right now to define long-term as even longer, which I'll share in a little bit. Board members can be very different depending on the type of board that you are looking at, or the type of board that they are trying to be, a working board versus oversight board, for example. We'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But overall, if you're looking at how much time do I have that I might be able to serve on a board, the commits are a little different by type. But typically in a private board or a public board, you're going to have anywhere from 4 to 6 board meetings, and then committee meetings are a supplement to that. The average you might look at based on our stats are about 10 hours a month combined for both board meetings and committee work. You do need to have some kind of argument for your expertise in the domain or the vertical in which that company operates or organization operates, and then be very clear about where your expertise fits in the committee structures, because most of them will have something like an audit committee, a comp committee, some kind of committee experience that fits within those boards is going to be part of what you want to differentiate where you belong. The next piece is a very strong commitment that we hold, is to know how your style of thinking fits within an existing board. Now, the responsibilities of a board are a little confusing depending on where you look around the globe, but fundamentally, by law, regardless of the type, one responsibility is to approve the corporate goals and strategy and plan. Now, the confusion around that often is that people think when you're on the board, you're setting the strategy, but you're not really. You're approving what management's responsibility is, which is to define and propose the strategy. It used to be the other way around, but it has changed with time. This is the way we create the check and balance. Now, one of the dilemmas of that is that people are starting to complain that they don't get to draw the resources and the wisdom from the board as much as they like, but there are ways to work that by having off sites and retreats where you talk about strategy, but you're not defining it for the company. The board must monitor and advise about the performance as they go through the planning cycle, whether that's 1 year or 3 years. They do select and oversee the performance evaluation of the CEO. They also set the compensation for the CEO. They may also, if you're in a public forum, oversee the compensation for the C-suite, particularly when it comes to stock and equity. They participate in any succession planning, largely for the CEO, but certainly for the C-suite as well, to make sure that the sustainability of the company is whole. And they are responsible to make sure that there is appropriate disclosure where it's regulatorily required, or whether there's financial disclosure that should be to other parties. They also have to make sure that they are doing risk mitigation, looking at what policies are in place and what dashboard is in place to make sure that the company is not in any high risk mode. And they participate in the authorization of any what we'd call material transactions, large events, acquisitions, or joint ventures and things that might dramatically change the face of the business. And of course, they also have the responsibility to make sure that we're, as an organization, adhering to better practices or best practices based on what data there is for improving the performance of the organization. Now, to understand the duty when you're sitting at the board table, there are some legal requirements that apply to all types of boards. It doesn't matter. And I'll just share a little bit about what those are. The first two are sort of sister rules, but the first is fiduciary duty of care, and then the second is business judgment. The duty of care means that the directors have to make decisions that are based on all available information that they can get. It has to show that they were deliberate, they secured as much information as possible, and then they make a choice based on their belief that what is decided is in the best interest of the company based on whatever they could secure at the time. Now, why is that important? Because if you've exercised that duty of care and you've acted in good faith on the basis of the material that you have, then you're not held liable if the shareholders decide that that was a really bad decision. If you've made it based on the reasonableness of the evidence in front of you at the time and it looks prudent and things change or there's an aha later, you are not liable as a director for a decision based on the information that is accrued later. The second piece of this has to do with your duty of loyalty, and that's tied to a duty of good faith. And this one's important because there are so many emerging cases now, and the exchanges are getting deeper into the audit of this. But the duty of loyalty means that when you're sitting in the chair as a director, your interests are first for the business. Secondarily, you may have some interest that would be a conflict of interest or could be, and you have a duty to disclose that and to recuse yourself if in fact that exists, or not even serve on a board if that's also an issue. There can be no conflict of interest if it has to do with yourself or some allied party, like a family member who had services that they're offering to the corporation on which you sit. So an important piece of this now is looking at whether there are any secondary matters that might be potential conflicts of interest. The latest one now is people looking at executives or directors who are doing crazy things like sharing a plane with the company, and isn't that a conflict of interest if you've got a financial deal that's going on? Those are all being audited right now. But the duty of good faith is to make sure that the minute there's anything that looks even suspiciously, potentially a conflict of interest, that you disclose it, and that your duty is to support in the best interest, separate your interest from anything else and vote or abstain based on where your conflict of interest may sit. Now, that sounds a little scary, and it certainly did to me when I first started serving on boards, because those responsibilities mean you're subjected to a lot of exploration of things that are personal otherwise, but you do have some protections, and it's important for you to understand where they are. Before you ever serve on a board, I highly encourage you to read the bylaws and the articles of incorporation so that you know what the architecture and infrastructure and the processes are that are creating the operation for the business. They're always different, unless, of course, in today's popular world, many early stage companies just buy their bylaws from LegalZoom and they're generic, and then you probably want to encourage them to update them right away. The bylaws are what I call the Bible. They have all the basic definitions of who's doing what and why, how you run your meetings, who the officers are, the definitions of conflict of interest, how you can amend the rules. It gives you the guidebook for which to adhere if you do want to make some changes or propose some recommendations going forward. If you have that in tow, you'll have a better sense for how to proceed and what you can drive and what you can't drive. The articles of incorporation can be robust or not, depending on where you sit in the United States. Different places have different articles of incorporation, but generally it gives you the basic information, and it is filed with the state. So if you do want to amend it, you have to submit it and update it, and you pay some money for it. But that needs to stay current with whatever's going on. Once you've understood that, the next thing is to ask. Make sure that that company that is inviting you has D&O insurance and that the policies are understood for you so that you know what kind of protection there is should the corporation ever deal with a lawsuit or a claim. Most places today will have some kind of D&O insurance that's basic, and it will become more expensive if there are claims that are charged against the company, and less expensive if there's a long history where there are no claims. It's good to check for that to make sure before you step on that you have some coverage. The only place in the world right now where you can't get this coverage, and for different reasons, is Australia. If you're stepping on a board there, you're much more in a position of risk, and there are requirements there that you must be certified to serve on a board so that you really know what you're doing, because it helps protect you more. A little bit about board structure. Here in the United States, we have what we call a one-tiered structure, which means that we typically have the CEO, maybe the CFO or another C-suite person in the board with the directors, and they're all smushed together. And that's a way to duke out the philosophy and the direction together. In those cases, there's also commonly committees that are set up. So in a public or a private board, you'll see the list here includes compensation, nom-gov, sometimes strategy, sometimes shareholder relations, depending on how active and dynamic that market is, and then audit for sure. You can see that the committees change a little bit in style or content, depending on whether it's a nonprofit or a municipal board. In an advisory board, there is no committee because you're really the kitchen cabinet for the CEO only, and you have very little risk. You're just a counselor or a consigliere, if you will. The board operations meeting 4 to 6 times typically have the duties that we have talked about in terms of oversight of the CEO and reviewing recommendations that the committees make. That is a confusion that many people have about the difference of the work in the committee compared to the board itself. Committees are set up to evaluate possible actions that need to be taken depending on the topic. For example, compensation. They'll do the homework, the performance evaluation of the CEO. They will recommend the compensation for the next year. They bring it forward to the board. The board must approve it. The committee can't do that independently, or they shouldn't do it independently anyway. We just audited a company in the Midwest that was giving the entitlements to the committee, and they didn't understand that when the committee made that decision and the board otherwise didn't know what that decision was, they are still liable for it. And they were up in arms when they realized there were decisions being made that they didn't like. So make sure that the committees are clear as to their job relative to the board, which is to recommend, and then the board approves. It's also important for the duty of care for the corporate brand and to uphold the interests of everybody that's involved with that enterprise. It's not just the shareholders, although we used to think that in the United States. Europe is pushing that so hard now to say that, no, we're not only responsible for the shareholders, the stakeholders, the customers, and the employees, we're responsible for the planet. Because if we don't take care of the planet, we don't have an operation worth talking about. Now, for those of you that are just starting to learn about where you might fit on a type of board, let's talk for a few minutes about the types of boards and what the trade-offs or the benefits are for each of these. There's no right or wrong answer whatsoever about which type of board, because every one of them offers some kind of opportunities to help you with your own career development. Nonprofit boards are really interesting. You have to join a nonprofit, at least I say, based on the fact that you love what they're doing, because it gives you a great chance to use your executive experience in a different way. And it allows you to understand a little bit more of the rubrics and the process that go with good governance. It also demands more time per month than most other types of boards. And you can see here the quote from BoardSource that the average number of hours per year it can be anywhere up to 100 hours, which is a lot more. If you join a nonprofit board, do it because you care deeply so that you don't feel that you're being overused or taken advantage of by the time demands. Most nonprofit boards are what I call working boards. So you get involved not only in the governance piece, but you get involved in the success of the operation itself, which means more rolling up your sleeves and doing some of what management would normally do. Most nonprofits are understaffed, unless they're the really large ones, but when they are, they need the help and the expertise of people who have the experience, which is why the time demands go up. So if you're looking at a nonprofit or you're on a nonprofit, make sure that your expertise is a good fit and that you've figured out which committees are best for you and whether you feel comfortable that this is one that will have sustainable passion for you. And more often than not, fundraising will be a key part of the role. It's not true with other boards necessarily, but if you're not comfortable with the ask or write the check and ask, it probably may not be the ideal fit for you. Advisory boards are the next. And in that case, you can expand your use of your own gifts by being a consigliere to a CEO. The advisory boards are fun because you are really on point for the business itself, and it helps round out a CEO who may have strengths in one area but not in others. It's also a very common practice for businesses that are shifting in some way. For example, I served on an advisory board a few years ago when they shifted from an electronics manufacturing corporation to a medical device one. And they wanted to learn up quickly so that they would know how to succeed when they've switched verticals. It's very common for companies to have advisory boards that are intensely used when they go into a new market. For example, if you're in the U.S. and you want to open business in Japan and you don't really understand the Japanese market, you may create an advisory board for that. Advisory boards are not necessarily long-lasting, although they can be if you're looking at the future of a product. Like the cannabis industry, a lot of the companies now have advisory boards because they want to understand the use of cannabis from a medical application side long-term. So if you're interested in bringing what you already know to help a CEO to improve the performance of the business, this is a great way to do it. It doesn't necessarily meet as often. It may meet once every quarter. It may meet for a half day instead of a typical board meeting, which might be a whole day. And the compensation associated with that is probably more often than not an honorarium, offset compensation for the day that you took, in the same way a consulting contract might be established. Sometimes in the early stage companies, you might get some stock as well. Municipal boards are a great way to contribute if you care a lot about the particular community that you're in, or you want to build your credibility, or you have a political mindset for what's going on in a particular area. And the topics in townships or citizenry interests are different in terms of the use of proceeds, etc. It can be pretty stimulating, and given everything that's going on in politics today, you'll see a lot more interest in people wanting to be active in this because they're tired of what they're listening to, which is great. And I uphold and honor anybody that wants to take a look at that, because this whole market makes me crazy, but I am so respectful of people who have the tenacity to do it. Private boards. Private boards allow you to have more of your executive presence. It gives you a sense for stretch because you're meeting with people who might be in a way contributing, but in a different way than you. It helps you build your personal connections in that way, but it also stretches your understanding of problem solving by virtue of if the board is chosen wisely on different types of directors because of their acumen or what expertise they bring. You're always in a learning mode while you're also giving. It would be important if you want to look at a private board to make sure that you have a balance of things that you bring to that group. So study who's already on that board to make sure that you're adding, you're not more of the same as something. And then take a look at whether the value that you can bring helps them with their long-term strategy, not their immediate strategy. Because if you've got something that's short, like I know how to get a commercial product, a product to a commercial market, then you're probably better serving on the advisory board to do that, or a consulting role, than it is a board role itself. And then make sure you screen for any conflicts of interest between what this company is doing and where you work, and identify which committee is your best one, and establish what would be the long-term value versus the short-term value. Public boards are, everybody thinks it's so romantic and exciting and great to be on a public board. Be careful with that. It's the highest risk one. It's very competitive to get on them. They're compensated well, which is why, of course, people think it's great. It's also good for your recognition professionally to be seen as selected on one. But it does have risk and reward tied together. And if you are considering your qualifications for that, know that you have to have something that's extremely differentiable relative to other people. So check with yourself to make sure that you've got the P&L experience that's important for this, that you've been an executive in a current role. In fact, I just was on the phone yesterday with some folks in Europe where they're pushing a mantra now about C before B. They're pushing because they're watching some high correlations, but if you've had C-suite experience, you're a better contributor at the board level than if you haven't. And they're pushing that with the idea that they would like to show the evidence of that and then make sure that the short list for the boards represent that deep experience. And then if you can argue that you've got the experience for cross boundaries, across international markets and things like that, typically these public boards are going to look for that. They're also going to look for experience with high stress situations that have been handled, for example, mergers or layoffs or things that have to do with scale and change management. They screen a lot for those. So this is the list of the fundamental criteria that you either have it or you don't have it, and that's going to be a cut for you on a public board. It's the most rigorous of all. Make sure your background check is clean. If you've had a C-suite candidate or you're a candidate for that role. If you've been on a board, this is the catch-22 of if I'm on one, it's easier to get on another one as opposed to the first one that you want to get on. Do you have any certification for board service that, while it's not legally required in the United States, it's still considered a one-up in terms of advantage? And so I encourage people to look at that. If you've had P&L experience, that's a plus. Do not think that you're doing this to make money. If you're counting on this as the way you're going to survive, that's probably not a good thing. You should have financial independence. Ensure that you have the time to commit. And life cycles are different depending on where you are. If you're suddenly doing a job and it's a highly international, high travel, it's probably not a good time to try and be on a board at the same time. If you've got the right domain expertise or something that's ancillary and needed by the company, that's a good thing. And that you are able to contribute within a committee structure in a way that's meaningful, and that you have a style or problem-solving orientation that's going to fit with what they need. So each of these different types have a different emphasis. And while any one of those could be fine, the important thing is to match your interest against the type of board that's best for you in any stage. Many people ask me, if I'm on a nonprofit, can I then stair-step up to a private board or a public board? And we do look at this. The nonprofit is not a staircase solution to moving into the others. What we have found, though, is that if you look at your college that you went to or the university that you attended and find that you could manage yourself as a candidate for a trustee on the university, that is considered more of a lateral arabesque to moving into a private or public. Don't know why, but it's important to look at that and see if your university is advocating to help. And I'm seeing a note, I find most C-level people are not as engaged. Lower levels such as VPs and directors are often more day-to-day and can provide very specific advice to boards. You're so right. And unfortunately, the activity is not seen that way in very many of the boards. The progressive early stage companies might look at that because they're looking for people who are influencers or able to bring a perspective that the board doesn't have. And you can see that with the old white guys in ties boards that bring in somebody that's young who understands social media, for example, because they don't, and they're willing to stretch a little bit. So yeah, there are occasions like that, but this push that's going on in Europe is tied to the quality of thought for the board is not as much about engagement as you think. It's much more about the strategic thinking of the business. And if you look at the contribution of the board, it's about seeing how things should be done by whom, not by us. So it is a dilemma, and I'm a big advocate for looking for where the gaps are and identifying and bringing in that fresh thinking where the gaps are, where a board may be missing that. Another question, what do you recommend for getting certifications? That's a great question. Yes, there is a training program at Stanford. In fact, there's training programs with most of the main universities that are available. There's also NACD, which has its own certification, and BoardWise does one in conjunction with Harvard every year, and we're doing our next one in June in 2019. Each of these are different, so you have to choose. The programs in Stanford or some of the other U.S. universities will use U.S. case law and U.S. cases to help with the certification. If you go to Vietnam or you go to Malaysia and you do it, the same thing would hold true. They're using their endemic case law. The one that we're doing at Harvard, if you're interested in international, is to bring cases in from all over the globe and look at global governance for reasons I'll share a little bit later. And there are a number of other association programs that you can take a look at, like the Corporate Secretaries Association, which are programs that are for people who are already on boards that are the corporate secretaries, and they have a certification program. So depending on where you sit or want to end up on a board, you can look at a number of those, and I'm happy to share some more information about that later. Is a board role in your future? If you're probing a little bit for this and getting a sense for where your appetite for risk is, where you think you can add the most value, and what your differentiation would be, the tricky part of differentiation in this case is while the market's a great time for women to be on boards, it's still very competitive to look at how can I stand above the crowd. And one of the factors that we feel strongly about is this whole discussion of diversity. It has been tied to gender, whereas we actually think it's much more important to look at it in a richer way. And what we are arguing is that it's not so much about whether we're wearing a skirt or wearing pants, but more around the style of thinking that we use, how we come at problems. And we've done a tremendous amount of research on this, looking at the psychometrics of how we come at problems, and it falls into these different buckets. And they're all valuable for different reasons. One is action, a bias towards get it done. One is how do we do it, which is the process. Another is who should be doing it and the understanding of the talent base to draw on to get it done. And the other is what should be done, which is the strategic or the ideation component of it. And we just don't all think the same way. While we may have one of all four of these, or all four of these rather, we have a certain dominance in the way that we approach problems. What we've done is create a tool that identifies those based on how you fill out some questions, and we've tested it in 37 countries, and we see 5 styles that are functional that come out of this, and then 5 that are dysfunctional that come out of it. I'll just share a little bit about these as we go around. The change driver is the person who has 92 ideas before breakfast. They love change. They love to break things that are broken just to try it another way and see if it works. And they think nothing is impossible. So they're very stimulating, and they build a lot of hope in people when they're stuck. You bring in a change driver and they say, oh, that's great, let's fix it. Here's 9 ways. The unifier is somebody who thinks more about the people, and they are a social moray, a conscience on the system. So that, imagine you're in a board where there's a lot of people and there's monopoly going on with the change driver talking too much and the challenger interrupting. And the unifier has this great skill to say, Sam, we've heard a lot from you, and I'd like to hear from Sally now. And the unifiers get the respect of the group because they're so careful in that consciousness and diplomacy skill that they can create more even-toned meetings. They can calm the group down when there's issues. It's a great asset to bring to a board. A challenger is somebody who's really gifted at seeing where a board is or where a corporation is and saying, we want to reset the zenith. We want to go here. And they're great in inspiring a group to say here to here, but they're not necessarily gifted on how, which is why a challenger and a change driver partner together really well, because the challenger will say A to B, and the change driver says, yep, and here's the ways we need to do it. And then they get the whole group jazzed, and they move forward. An advisor expert is somebody who typically has a swim lane that they bring, deep financial expertise or deep legal expertise, very common. And they bring that so that the rest of the group can be informed by that, but don't have to learn it themselves. And that earns them some respect in that way. The statesperson, interestingly enough, is the only one that is unique in that they have an even amount of all 4. So they become the natural person to be the director of the board, or certainly a comp committee or committee chair, because they can help broker deals when 2 views don't understand each other. They can translate, and they really come to an outcome for the group. They help in that way. Now, you'll see in the chart here that below each one are what I would call the dark sides of every style. When a group is under stress, an organization is under stress, or an individual is in stress, there is a pattern that is possible for people to revert to. So with a change driver who has these 90 ideas, when they're under stress, they can oftentimes go back and say, what are you doing about that idea? What are you doing about that idea? What are you doing about that idea? And overwhelm the system. Or they can disrupt in another way by saying, never mind that idea I gave you yesterday and spent 8 hours working on. I changed my mind. You can't change it for me. Ha, ha, ha. And so there's an overwhelm that comes from that, which may or may not happen to anybody who finds out they're a change driver, but it's something to watch for. The unifier, because balance and calm and harmony are so important for a unifier, may be subjected to a syndrome of shutting down and not voicing a thought. So imagine you're in a board and there's a debate going on, and they really work through it, and they get to this point where everybody settles on something, but in the back of your head, you're a unifier saying, I'm not comfortable with that. The unifier may say, I'm not going to bring up my discomfort because everybody's so happy. I'll just forgive it. And we have to encourage the unifier to say, no, your duty of care is to voice the concern, because if that idea isn't strong enough, they have to work harder to get it up. So these are vulnerabilities that go with it. The challenger tends to sometimes voice their zenith idea in a critical way, like, we're here, we need to get here, damn it, as opposed to, it'd be great, I love where we are, and I can't wait till we get here, which is an orientation and a tone issue. And the advisor experts sometimes are so respectful of the work it took to be an expert in his or her own field that they tend to be quiet when it's a topic outside of their scope, because they respect other people for their opinions. And so they may have an idea, and they would secretly go to the statesperson and say, hey, I've got this idea, but you say it because it's not appropriate for me. And then I'll just say, that's a really good idea, and endorse it, which isn't the way you want to create transparency. So we encourage advisors to get more broad in their strategic thinking so that they contribute in a whole way, not just a vertical way. So the important thing is we don't all think alike. We come at problems in different ways. Sometimes we can argue that it's men and women and that they think differently, but it's an appreciation for that. And why is that important? What we know is that, based on studies where you look at correlations of board performance, that these factors that you think would matter, like showing up and training and keeping people aware of what's going on and having an independent board director, all of these things should matter. But the one that actually correlates is the social fitness, the functionality of the team. Is it respectful, trustful, candid, and capable of operating and working well together? And we need to work on that, because we're not particularly gifted in our social fitness, which I'll share a bit about. In the governance landscape today, this is even more important, because the dynamics that are going on in the boards are different. In the US, it's about protecting shareholders. In Europe, it's about protecting everything, including the globe. And in China, it's about disenfranchising the conflicts of interest between the state-owned enterprise component versus the shareholders that are independent. And one of the issues that's associated with this is that governance is under scrutiny right now because it didn't perform very well. And with the collapse of the banks and everything that was going on, everybody's trying different experiments on how to make governance better. Sometimes they're saying fix the structure. Sometimes it's the accountabilities. Let's reframe the processes. Let's pick different types of people. Let's sort people up, find some better efficiencies. And everybody's experimenting, but we don't really know what's going to hold as a process improvement because there isn't enough time to test yet. It takes 5 to 7 years to see if there's a tracking mechanism that tells what these experiments tell us. But we do know at a global level that these sorts of things around transparency and fulfilling your duties and being competent are all the general rules, the checks and balances. Our expectations, no matter what country you look at, that we want to have those as fundamentals for good performance. And then one argument, for example, you take the structure in the US and the UK, we have what I mentioned before was a one-tiered structure. Where you go to the Netherlands and many parts of Germany, it's a two-tiered structure. You have a management board and you have a supervisory board. The two are not the same, but they have to interrelate. And they have a division of duties, and then they have to come together on certain components. That's a very different model. China has a two-tier, but they call it side-by-side because the government is on one side and the business is on the other. And there are lots of experiments or reconsiderations on the parts of companies that are like in the Netherlands and Germany saying maybe we should go to a one structure. But the truth is, on the research that we found, that it doesn't really matter. The complaining that has caused it, people say the boards don't work. Look at this; they're useless. They're equal to tonsils. They don't help. And all these complaints that had happened, they'd say, well, let's switch the structure. But we found out that really it doesn't matter which structure. What does matter is that the data and the availability of information to protect checks and balances and distributed power is, as long as that's in play, any one of those structures is okay. But if it's not in play, none of those structures will work. So it's much more about making sure your processes and access to information is symmetrical for whatever structure you have. Another issue is that the governance is different by structure and belief structures within regions. So there are some people who believe that checks and balances make governance work. Others believe that it's behavior. Some believe that it's market discipline, which means that the market will put pressure on whatever company to perform. Another is rules and processes make the difference. And market ordering is when they say, well, all right, we'll own it as a vertical. So when the banking industry collapsed or was having all the problems, the secondary governance rules were set in by the banking institutions, which were even more rigorous than what the federal government says. So if you were to look and say, all right, here's a spider web to take a look at that. Before the crisis, the financial crisis, this is what government and economists were saying were the important factors: market discipline and checks and balances. Then the world blows up with all of this stuff, and they said, well, that didn't work, so what do we switch it to? And this is what it looks like today. It's much more about rules, behavior, and market ordering, which is why I say be careful if you want to go onto a public board, because so much more of what you're doing during the hours that you're working has to do with regulatory rules and compliance than ever before. So countries are trying different experiments. You can see this with UK shift on checks and balances different from the Netherlands, China yet again, and the US is moving more to rules and processes. And given that our culture is more independent cowboys, there's a lot of pushback on that. But the question is, can we create anything that's global? And because nobody sits above the nation state to second guess this, it's going to be a long time before we have something that we call a global standard for good governance. And who would have the nerve to take on that duty? Because governments across the globe fight all the time. So these are 10 trends you want to watch out for as you're going forward. There's an increase now in the requirements for more strategic engagement between the board directors and management. The definition of what it means to be accountable is stretching, and that's due to Europe saying that the duties of care are so much broader, and many of the companies here in the United States can't stand that because it's just more obligations. But where best practices are pushed, we're going to have to follow. Companies are going slower in taking time to go to the exchanges and become public. If you watch the unicorns like Uber and some of the companies now that are staying private longer because there's new access to capital, that's important to know that you don't necessarily have to go public anymore. Diversity is a big push, obviously, we know that one. And that there's an increase now in the voice of investors, which is why shareholder activism has become such an important piece, which causes companies to look at investor relations as a stronger element for success. And the requirements to get institutional capital have been increased, and they're more rigorous than they used to be. The strongest institutional investor funds have all signed a Blue Ribbon Commission document that says there are more requirements before they will invest. The continuing education components are important. Disclosure is getting much more broad, not just in Vietnam, but everywhere we turn now, it's getting more rigorous. The environmental, social responsibility, and governance requirements are part of what the institutional investors are endorsing as well, which means that companies have to record and document and track their performance in those areas. And the regulations and reinforcement are getting tighter. I could talk hours on that, but I want to talk about diversity because we know it's good. We've researched that. Everybody's talking about it. We know, but why aren't we there? Look at the blue spots where, there are countries that we're looking at right now to say, we're just not living up to what we want. And one of the problems with this is that board directors, even intellectually, will say, yeah, we want diversity, but when they get it, here's the research that says they don't know how to handle it. Women are saying, when I'm on a board, I'm not listened to. Men are saying, and women are saying, there's not an equality in the voices. We're not treated as credible. There's stereotypical expectations going on. there seems to be something that isn't quite whole, or the experience base is wrong. What happens psychologically is people say they want it, but then when they get this alien resource in the room, they go into what psychologists call exogenous shock. They thought they want it, but then they don't know how to handle it. The issue, as I see it, is that the currency of business is trust, and we're just not wired for trust. We start from an unconscious bias about tribalism or club or social, collaboration in a way where we're comfortable with certain people and we're not necessarily with people we don't understand. And if we understand that about ourselves, and we can underscore the duty to get clear about where our intrinsic biases are, and then create a way to build our competencies, we need to recruit for people who are really good brokers of social trust, which are skills around integrative thinking, creating influence in a diplomatic way so that you can have impact as a whole group who appreciates the difference of thought among the parties around the table. The hard part of that with boards is that you only meet 6 times a year. I've been on boards where it's taken 3 years before I truly knew the people around the table in a way that made it honorable, that you could respect how people were thinking. And so we're recommending that boards, because they're so episodic, can build their rapport by taking time outside the boardroom to develop that rapport and that understanding, and you'll have a better result in the boardroom itself. So if I haven't chewed your ear off too swiftly here, what things can you do if you'd like to become a great director? First of all, be realistic about the time it takes. And, much of the work is still going to be yours. The network can help you, but you have to get some focus to be able to do that. And it's also good to understand how the nomination and election process works within various organizations, because it's not the same. Getting in is now going through the Nom and Gov committee more directly than it ever was before. There used to be a time when the CEO was the person who could pick their favorites, but it doesn't work that way anymore. Be really conscientious about what skills you feel you need to develop, and then match. I had one gentleman who was in the oil and gas business who wanted to move into a lateral that would use his. He did all the research. He honed it down to 5 companies. He wrote one letter that was the reason why he would be good, and he got 5 offers. That's all work that he did, though. What we see is more people who write a board bio and then they give it to all their friends and say, hey, let me know if you hear of anything. And that doesn't quite work. It might help if your board bio is really, really clear about what your differentiation strategy is and what you're bringing and what your goal is. But it takes a little more than that. And one of my colleagues says, you are who you hang with. If you want to get on board, you've got to hang with a lot of board directors, go to events where they are so that you're building your reputation, your familiarity among the people who really do know where the openings are. Because only 15 to 17% are selected by boards who use Spencer Stewart or some of the other executive search firms. Most of it still is peer-based. It used to be male-based and what have you, but it's no longer that. It really is peer-based. So I also encourage you to take advantage of some resources. Board Prospects is free. It's the LinkedIn for directors. Go for it. Sign up. You'll get lots of information pushed out, and you can also self-nominate for board positions. They just had one listed this morning, which is for a public company that looked really interesting. The Board Access Program, which of course we do together with Watermark, the Directors Associations, all of the NACDs, the Silicon Valley Directors Exchange, the Women Corporate Directors have programs that you can get involved in. The university training, which I mentioned a little bit before, these are all available for you. Then certification programs, which are somewhat equivalent, although you do get a diploma and you can cite that on your resume and what have you. The alumni programs, Stanford has them, a bunch of the different schools have them, so research where you went and see if there's something that's an advocate program for you. And sign up for the newsletters and the updates. Deloitte has a great program, and they do updates on governance and hot topics. Spencer Stewart has one. And check on LinkedIn for some of the blogging groups as well, because they have them. And when it comes to the competencies, you can never be too wise. You have to keep working on yourself and just be more and more every day, because the duties and the responsibilities and the wisdom required for corporate governance is sometimes astonishing. I signed up for Long Now Foundation, which is $8 a month on education, and it's all futurists who talk about different subjects, and I love it because it's the cheapest education in the world to just keep working on yourself and what you bring to the table. These are the skills that are oftentimes now looked at by directors or non-gov committees for directors going forward. You can see the shift in some of these in terms of social fitness as an example of one of the things that we don't do that very well. We need to learn how to do it. If you're in the front end of this process, start by assessing how ready you are. We have a tool that we call Bona Fide that does that, so you're welcome to join and fill that out, and then figure out which industry professional groups that you can affiliate with that will help get you into a vertical that makes some sense for you. Prepare a board bio and a personal action plan that will help you get from I'm just starting to landing. The realistic perspective for that can be 12 to 18 months, depending on what type of board you're looking for. And then get out there and talk to people. Sitting directors, search firms, the network that you know will be interested. It's a part-time job to get that job, but I encourage anybody who's interested to do it because this is the time.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed this program.